Alright, so you've probably seen dynamic advanced layouts like this one. I'm going to show you how to create this layout with literally zero media queries. This is all going to be CSS Grid and some cool CSS functions. You just need one media query, and that's just to make this first and last item, like this one and this one right here, take up 2 columns instead of 1 to achieve this layout. Everything else we're going to do with CSS Grid and some responsive functions. No media queries. So to get started with this, let's first go to my code here. And you can see I already have a list of benefits to render over here. Let's start to add the code over here. So first things first, I'm going to rename this div into a section. And I'm going to give it some classes. So give it some padding and a background of white, and inside this let's create a container. We'll create a div and we'll give it a max width of 7XL, which is 1280 pixels, and margin auto. We'll also give it some horizontal padding, and in here now we'll create a grid. And we'll give it these columns. Just copy this exactly as I do it. It's gonna look a bit weird, a bit complicated, but I'll explain how all of this works in a bit. And we'll also give some gap over here. Now, these columns do look a lot complicated, and I will explain this in just a bit. But first, let's create this whole layout. Now, inside of this div, in this grid, let's render the benefits list that we have. This will be a div, and it'll have the key, and it will have these classes, some padding, it'll be rounded, and have a shadow and a background of gray 50. And we'll also make it so that on the MD breakpoint, the first and last items in this grid will take up 2 columns instead of 1. And this will give us the layout that we want. So do the same thing for the last item. And also overflow hidden, so we don't have any overflow issues with this. Now inside of this, let's render the actual content for each benefit. I'll create an H4 and I'll give it the classes text 3XL and semi-bold font and some margin bottom. And here we'll render the title of this, and right below this let's create a paragraph with gray 500, and here we'll render the benefit text. Now below this let's also render the image, and I'll give it some margin top just to separate it from the text. And in here let's create an image component and render the image right here. And let's also give it some classes to style this. We'll give it full width and make it rounded. Give it a border of gray 300. And with that, we are done with this. Now let's actually go and see what this actually looks like. So if you can see over here, we have actually achieved all of the layout that we wanted. It looks exactly like I showed you, and if I go to the developer tools and resize this, you can see it's actually responsive as well. So on smaller screens it shifts to this layout, and if we go even smaller than this, then it just shifts to a single column layout. So all of this is fully responsive. and we've achieved the layout that we wanted. So how exactly does this work? Let's go through this step by step. So first of all, we have a section over here. This is just standard padding background. This is nothing complicated. Inside we have a div, which is basically a container for all of our content. I gave it a max width and I gave it some margin auto to center it. So we have a container and a max width for the entire section. And in here we have our grid, and this is where all the magic is happening. So if we go inside this div, and also before we discuss the grid, we need to look at this media query over here inside the benefits where we render each benefit. What we're doing over here is we're taking the first and the last item in this grid, and we're making it so that it spans 2 columns instead of 1 on medium screens and above, which is exactly what gives us the layout that we want. So over here you can see the first and the last items take up 2 columns instead of 1, and that's what gives us this layout. And if I shrink below the MD breakpoint, which is at 768 pixels, if I resize this all the way down to 768 and below, right here, you'll see that the first and last items are now taking up only 1 column instead of 2. Now the most important part of this whole layout is this class right here, which defines the grid's columns. And this looks very complicated as a Tailwind class, so I'm going to turn this into CSS, and then we're going to see how it actually works. So this is the CSS that this class right here will generate. So let's look at this. First, we have the repeat function, and this just tells our grid to repeat as many columns as it can. And then inside this we have the autofit keyword, which, there we go, the autofit keyword, and this just gives us the responsiveness that we want. This autofit keyword is going to try and fit as many columns as it can based on the minimum and maximum column size that we define later in this min-max function. And now min-max is going to take 2 arguments, which is the minimum column size and the maximum column size. The maximum size that we give this over here is 1FR, which is just to make each column take up as much space as it fractionally can. And this whole function right here is the minimum size that each column can be. So inside of this min function right here, we have another max function. So first let's look at that one inside. This is also going to take 2 arguments, and it's just going to return whichever is larger. That's why it's called max. So we're saying 300 pixels or 100% of the screen divided by 4. And why 4 over here? Because we need at least 3 columns to create this layout that we want. If I show you the layout again, you can see we need at least 3 columns to make this whole layout. We need 2 columns for this first element and at least 1 column for this second element. Same thing down here. So we need at least 3 columns for this layout. And we also have a bunch of gap between each column, which is why we want to give this 4 columns right here, just to accommodate the gap. If we didn't have the gap, this would be 100% divided by 3. So that's why we divide the screen, or divide 100% by 4. Now what this max function is doing is it's saying if 300 pixels is larger than 100% of the screen divided by 4, then give us 300 pixels. Otherwise, give us 100% divided by 4. So on large screens, 100% divided by 4 is bigger than 300 pixels, which means that's the value we're going to get on large screens. But on smaller screens, we're going to get this 300 pixel value. Now, the result of this max function is what gets passed into this min function here outside. And the min function just does the same thing as the max, but it gives us the minimum value instead of the maximum value. So it takes 2 values and it returns the minimum value out of those 2 values. Now on large screens, whatever value we get from this max function is automatically going to be smaller than 100%, because any value you get from over here is just going to be smaller than 100% of the screen, right? So by default, on large screens, the max function's value that we get over here, this will be the minimum value, and this is what will be ultimately passed into the min-max function as the minimum column size. But on small screens, if we look at the max function, 300 pixels is going to be bigger than 100% of the screen divided by 4. So we're going to get 300 pixels from the max function here on small screens. Then that 300 pixel in this min function is going to be greater than 100% of the screen if we're on mobile or small screens. So that will become the minimum value for our column size, 300 pixels on small screens. And this will just avoid the the overflow issues that we may run into, because then we'll get 100% of the screen as the minimum column size instead of a hard-coded value like 300 pixels. And this will just help us avoid any nasty overflow issues and make our site fully responsive. And that's about it. On small screens, the 300 pixel becomes the 100% becomes the column size, and on larger screens, this max function's result becomes the minimum column size. And that's how this whole layout works. Now hopefully I explained everything clearly, but I would encourage you to recreate this in your own code somewhere and just play around with the values and see what you get. Experiment with the math here, and you'll have a much better and clearer understanding of everything that I just said.